Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the training here. As we said before, my name is Tony Clarke. This is my video for recertification as an instructor with 3M for fall protection. In this case, the module I'm going to be teaching is from the Fall Protection Inspector course, which is course number 6222. Okay, so when last we left, we had talked about a general introduction. We'd given the safety rules for the site, one of which, of course, in the land of COVID is an expectation we're going to be wearing face masks. Right now, I've planned you all at least 6 feet away from me, so at this point, I'm going to go back to our basic understanding, which is we can remove the mask. But as we mentioned earlier, when you're speaking, if you're going to come into somebody else's zone, as you will later on, you will be required to make sure that the masks are on to ensure protection of each other, if anything, just for respect more than anything else. So in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to cover off inspection oversight. Specifically, what we're going to look at is we're going to discover the legal necessity to inspect equipment. We're going to encounter various standard setting groups and learn their roles. We're going to discuss how and why a company's policies can impact equipment inspection. We're going to understand the manufacturer's inspection requirements. We're going to learn about supplemental information released by equipment manufacturers. And of course, we'll explore a manufacturer's operating manuals and its inspection requirements. So right at the top, before we go into the textbook stuff and we actually learn something, the question I've got for you is, as an inspector on our site, according to our own corporate policies, how often are you required to conduct a full inspection of the fall protection equipment in your possession?
So here on site, we are recommended to do quarterly inspections on our equipment.
Actually, it's not a recommendation. It's from the head office. It's a mandatory requirement at our location. Every piece of fall protection equipment, whether it's retractable, whether of course it's your shock absorbing lanyard and your harness and your lanyards and so forth, every piece of equipment has to be inspected 4 times a year by a qualified inspector. And that's an inspector who, by definition, isn't the person who's using the gear themselves. So, for example, if I'm an inspector and I have fall protection equipment, obviously my quarterly inspection is going to be done by another inspector to ensure that there's a good set of eyes on it, a fresh set of eyes. And normally it's an annual process, or 6 months to a year, but we'll talk about that later on. Who has the same equipment inspection requirements? Well, that's pretty easy. We've got everybody from the government, both at the federal level and the territorial level, as we are in Northwest Territories. There are the manufacturers. We have our own corporate policies, which are in often cases higher than other people's policies and procedures. We also have the state that's going to be done by groups such as voluntary compliance organizations and standard setting organizations such as CSA, Canadian Standards Association. So again, occupational health and safety regulations governing your geographic location and or industry. So that, where we are, is the Mine Health and Safety Act and regulations of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, as regulated by the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. We have the standard bodies. Those are the organizations responsible for any equipment design and testing standards, and that may be adapted by jurisdictions or employers. So for example, in our case, the primary body that we deal with is CSA, that is the Canadian Standards Association. We also have the employer, and as mentioned earlier, we have both organization OPs, operational procedures. We have SHIOPs, which are safety, health, and environment operational procedures that relate back to working at heights. And then, of course, we have the international directives from our worldwide headquarters. And of course, finally, we have MUM. That's the manufacturer's operating manual. That's we're the company that designed and built the equipment which provides strict inspection criteria and requirements. So it's their tools, they've designed them, they built them, it's their rules, so to say. When we look at our jurisdiction's regulations, they may or may not state requirements pertaining to fall protection equipment inspection. When we look at the regulations, what they might talk about is what gear has met their requirements. So again, in the Northwest Territories, it's almost all entirely CSA, Canadian Standards Association, requirements have to be met. However, there are exceptions. Some equipment doesn't go through CSA, but goes through a separate testing process through organizations such as NFPA, National Fire Protection Association. Now, NFPA is designed for firefighting and fire rescue gear, which again is outside the scope of your training today. The regulations also talk about end user inspection of fall protection equipment prior to each use, and that's very solid. What you folks are doing is taking a piece of equipment and basically ensuring that there's nothing there that realistically could harm a person, maybe even a month down the pipe. Whereas what they're saying is that in addition to your requirements, there's also a requirement that for me as a person who's an end user, that's the person who puts on the harness and walks on top of the building, as an end user, there's an expectation that every single day, without exception, I will inspect the gear at the start and inspect the gear upon completion to make sure that there's nothing that's likely to cause me harm. Within the regulations, there's also talk about employers and employees adhering to the equipment manufacturer's instructions. And often the case we find within the regs, there's a comment that says, or a variant of the manufacturer's specifications, or what is found as per manufacturer's instructions. The reality is within the law is you're required, however, to inspect equipment manufacturer's instructions, including what they say about inspections, and we'll talk about that later on. So in other words, you as an inspector or you as an end user are expected to know what the manufacturer says about the gear. These are the groups that play some role in the design or the standard set. CSA, Canadian Standards Association, Canadian. ANSI, American National Standards Institute. With ANSI and CSA, there are variances on their standards for harnesses. For example, in Canada, a requirement for testing to minus 35 degrees Celsius, whereas that may not be present in the US standard. And that's one of the reasons why we go to CSA as opposed to ANSI for most of our stuff. Having said that, we will find out later on that there are some pieces of equipment, such as nets, that don't actually have an associated CSA standard to it, but they do have one for ANSI. So if you want to find out about limitations and capacities or what they should be built to, we find we have to go to the Americans to figure out what's best in that regard. We have CEN, which is the European Standards Association. We have ISO, International Standards Organization. When we talk about ISO, what we're often talking about is the process, for manufacturing, quality assurance, and so forth. So when you look at an ISO standard such as 9001, what you're talking about is how the product was made as opposed to the standards to which it was made to. Employer policies may go above and beyond the minimum acceptable level of safety. For example, an employer may require more frequent formal inspections. That's our policy. The CSA standards talk about a minimum of once per year. The manufacturer, for a lot of the gear that we have on site, talks about qualified inspector conducting an inspection on it every 6 months to a year, and we say 3 months because we want to make sure that nothing slips through the crack. There's a requirement, for example, here that we have to document each and every pre-use inspection. We also identify maximum service life for a particular piece of equipment, whether or not the manufacturer provides one. So again, as we talk about later on, our firefighting gear, which is also 3M products for most of it, for rope rescue and for harnesses and so forth, has a requirement that regardless of use, 5 years it's retired. The manufacturers typically say, with few exceptions, that it is a piece of equipment that can be used as long to any time frame, in many cases, up until a point where it's deemed not safe to do so by either a personal inspection, pre-use inspection, a qualified inspector coming in, or, for example, a standard changing in such a dramatic way that the piece of equipment no longer is valid in, say, 2020. Policies go into things such as tagging and assigning equipment. Again, we all know about the colors that we use here on site, and mandating the use of equipment approved to a specific standard. By the way, have you ever read the OP? Jamie.
Yes.
What is the current OP for working at heights?
It is OP 124, working at heights and fall protection.
Yeah, you should know that because you're definitely in the process of reviewing that right now, if I recall correctly. And you look at that little document, and it definitely goes far beyond what the regulations state in the Northwest Territories, and it goes far beyond anything the CSA or even the manufacturer could imagine. For example, within our policy, nobody works at height, as you're aware, without wearing a chin strap on their helmet. There's nothing in the law or the standard that says you have to. It's just we've identified the risk as an organization. But I do strongly encourage you to read it. As a matter of fact, as we have a longer day than the usual inspector's course, we'll actually have about 30 minutes put aside later on to just go through and read that document and clearly understand it to meet our site-specific requirements. Manufacturers of safety equipment know the construction capabilities and limitations of their equipment the best. So when we look at a document like the manufacturer's manual, you need to basically pay attention to them because they do know what they're talking about. And it's required by law that we understand or at least are aware of what's in that document. End users, and especially anyone involved in formal inspection, ought to be familiar with all the requirements. And that's one thing. You don't have to know it word for word. It's going to be pretty difficult to go through a 20-page document and memorize it, knowing that you have about 183 other documents to read. Nobody's going to expect you to know that much. But I will say this. If you've read it once or twice, at least that will give you the understanding of what's there. And you should be able to go out and say, I think I remember. And before you do something silly, you can go through to this manual and say, okay, I can't hook up 3 lanyards side by side by side because the manufacturer told you to, or told you not to. Most manufacturers require a trained person other than the end user to inspect the equipment at least annually, or more frequently in some cases, and we've already discussed that. Formal inspections may also be required if significant time has passed since the piece of equipment was last used. Again, here, that's a no-brainer. It doesn't matter whether it's used every day or it's used once every 10 years. Every 3 months, that piece of kit is going to be inspected by one of you two folks, or any of the people that have already been trained before you. And as I mentioned earlier, there's darn good reasons for it. We never want to have things like this happen at our site. We never want to have damaged equipment put out into the universe to use. And if a user does that, that's shame on them. But at least with you folks, we're going to hopefully prevent that from ever happening here. Technical bulletins. There are different types of technical bulletins that get sent out. Within the safety, health, risk, and training team, most of us subscribe to the different organizations and we get it. Within the logistics team, they get these bulletins. And some of our partners, even our competitors, get them. And guess what? We share the knowledge. And that's a critical thing that people don't realize, is that if we haven't received the information, somebody else has it, and we're not going to hide it from anybody. Now, if you want to, and I expect this, by the way, because we'll be quizzing you on this in the next couple of weeks, we expect you to go to the manufacturer's websites, whether it's 3M for the DBI, Sala, Protecta, and so forth brands, or whether it's Safety Direct, because we use some of their equipment here, and those are the only two pieces of equipment that are allowed here. You're going to go through their site and you're going to look to see what news do they have for you, what recalls are occurring, and you want to make sure you're up on top of that, because if a piece of equipment comes to you and there's a recall on it and you missed it, I'm not going to lay blame here because we don't do that, but think about how you're going to feel if all of a sudden 2 months later you find out you missed something. So as an inspector, that's one of the most critical things you can do, is keep up to date on what's out there for recalls. We do have sample bulletins that we're looking at later on, but again, bulletins can be simple. For example, a corporate one. 3M Fault Protection has reported the possibility of a manufacturing defect in a dorsal D-ring of a specific type of harness between January 16th and December 2018. There has been no reported incidents involving this condition over 2 years. The potential hazard is of great concern because of the probability. So we get this bulletin, we pen it to you, you go out there and somebody's going to find it if it's on our site. Other things that we see for the manufacturers. For example, this, which is a manufacturer's report on permanent marker rating on webbing. Again, all this stuff is critical and may change the way that we do business. Inspection versus recertification. Inspections, that's what you do. They're, on the majority of fault protection equipment, may be performed by trained and competent individuals as defined by the manufacturer. On the other hand, certain pieces of equipment, certain systems or pieces of equipment must be periodically recertified or serviced by a qualified person. So for example, our HLs, horizontal lifelines, don't worry. They're complicated, they're big, they're bad. They do a fantastic job of protecting us, but there's no expectation that in 4 to 8 hours of training, you're going to be able to do those, at least in this course. We've got other people we can call upon, the manufacturers, for example, to do that. Safety nets. We don't use any on site, but if we were, and there's potential for it in the future, we'd want to make sure that we had somebody who had the ability to really go down and analyze it. And usually, as we'll talk about later on with safety nets, there's a lot of involvement with the gears, with the engineers. Guardrails. Although each one of us is expected to recognize the surface challenges and hazards of those guardrails, again, any in-depth inspection or investigation into them is going to be done by a qualified person. And again, it's not going to be you at this time. And some self-retracting devices. And that's going to be when we talk about recertification down south with manufacturer when it's required. But those are another day, another story. Of course, we have MUM. And of course, what do we find in the manufacturer's operating manual? That's very simple. We find instructions as to how to carry out the task. We find the limitations of the device. Not only that, we find the requirements for inspection, manufacturer's date, if there's an expiry date on it. We also find what it's compatible with and what it might not be compatible with. Heck, we may be able to even find things like this. Can we use a pen on it or not? There's a lot of information there, and again, you have to be able to know where you can look for this information. Now, I'm going to give you the manufacturer's operating manual. And what I'd like you to do is over the next couple minutes, I'd like you to look through that manufacturer's manual and try to find just a little piece of information. Nothing in particular right now. Okay, 10 minutes later, you've all had a chance to look through that. Great. Here's what we come up with answers. Oops. So, observations, what did you find? Oh, I found the name. Good, that's good to know. Found the date, what page is it on? Good. Oh yeah, overall, great job. So at this point, it's 10:53. So this is a perfect time to go for a coffee break. So 10:53, we'll see you back here in 17 minutes. Thank you very much for your time. Again, Tony Clarke, September 3rd, 2020. This has been a videotaped assessment for me as a competent inspector instructor for 3M. This is not for operational training purposes. Thank you very much. Have a good day.